Welcome back to another episode of the Relationship Toolbox, a show about building positive relationships with others. In the last shows, we've talked about numerous skills that we've pulled from our toolbox here, such as I messages, staying curious, reframing, restating, using I messages, and also the different styles of conflict resolution, the 6 styles that we went through. Today we're going to talk about the conflict cycle. And the conflict cycle is a way of demonstrating what's going on when we're having a disagreement with someone so that we can begin to analyze it, look at it, and make corrections using some of these skills. So we're going to introduce the conflict cycle with the role play, actually, or a situation between a husband and a wife. The first step of the conflict cycle is the triggering event, which is indicated right up here. And in the triggering event, that's something that happens that really grabs my emotions. And it's not something that I can ignore. I'm going to react to it. And I should mention that these dots here, these circles, represent one person here and another person here that we might be in an argument with. So the triggering event here in this situation between a husband and a wife might be this.
Maybe even before we get to that, Tom, we should talk about the other elements here.
Sure.
And
Okay.
in order to understand and be aware of how to use the conflict cycle, you have to be able to do 3 things. You have to be able to identify your emotions. Because, and that can be hard, because sometimes you're just flooded. You're like, and you're not really sure what it is. But if you can identify what your emotion is, that is helpful. Also, as you're moving through the cycles, you need to be able to identify and recognize the thoughts that you're having around that emotion as a reaction to that emotion. And finally, be able to recognize your own behavior. Which might be a result of that emotion and that thought. And that's a lot to ask in the moment. And this conflict cycle it's hard to use initially in the moment. And it's also more of a context and an awareness of how conflict can be rather than a skill per se, like an I statement is something that you're doing in the moment, or a reframing or restating. Those are activities that you're doing. But an awareness of this is kind of like a roadmap, like where am I right now in this conflict? You certainly don't need to have this kind of scrutiny with everybody that you're interacting with, but it works well if you're trying to debrief something that didn't go well, or if you're anticipating having a difficult conversation and you could see the pitfalls and the places that you might be able to project could be a problem. So we need to be able to think about our emotions, our feelings, our thoughts, and our behaviors. And now maybe we could talk about a specific event.
Sure, because that triggering event, again, if we were to use a situation between a husband and wife, and pointing out too the fact that our personalities are different, obviously, and we have different sensitivities. So something that might be a triggering event to one person might be no big deal to another. So let's start with this one in our situation so people can see how this might work. So Marcia, if you were, say, playing the role of the wife, what would you say that might be a triggering event for a husband?
You have a bad habit of interrupting me.
Now, if I were a husband, that might come across the wrong way for me.
It might trigger something.
That might trigger some reactions. So when that happens, when that becomes a triggering event, the second step of the conflict cycle is that I immediately experience some type of feeling, some type of emotion. Emotions typically can be described in one word. So if someone says, well, I felt like I was an absolute fool, or I felt like this or that, they're really talking about a thought, not a feeling. So if I say, wow, when you said that, I really felt annoyed with it. So that would be the second step, that sort of gut level reaction to something, which can happen in a millisecond. It happens really before I even am aware of it. So once I become aware of it, then I go into the third step of this cycle, which is actually a thought that I'm beginning to think. And that's in my head at this point. I haven't expressed it. So in my head, I might be thinking such a reaction to that as,
What? How dare she criticize me? She does that too. Or, you know, depending on the emotion you had, if you're annoyed, it could be that. You could also be shamed, and you might be like, oh God, you know, oh, I hate that behavior in me and in her, but I'm going to get defensive about it because I don't want to admit it. Or,
Right.
You know, depending on that.
You might be confused.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? I don't do that.
Or accusatory. If you do think that the other person also exhibits the same behavior they're criticizing you, it's like, well, what a hypocrite you are. You know? So, you know, depending on the emotion you feel, that will color your thought.
sure.
It could be any of those
And these
thoughts.
do sort of flow together, and as you say, color each other, they flood into each other. So that would be what I would be thinking in my mind. And now the third step for me is to actually put it into a behavior. So I have to take what I'm feeling, the emotion, or we can have more than one at a time, and those thoughts, and I need to express it in some type of behavior. So that I might be expressing my annoyance with getting very verbally aggressive with it, talking back to you, even a type of verbal attack, or as you mentioned, I might just withdraw with it. But anyway, it is quite an onslaught to me, and it has become that triggering event for me. Okay, so now we go to, we've talked about the fourth and final step there, and what I might do in there.
Whatever your behavior is, it's going to create a new triggering event.
That's right, and that's how
For
this
me.
cycle begins
Yeah.
to work.
Yeah.
And it goes around and around.
But before we get to how this works, let's review once more, what are these steps then, Tracy, that
Yeah.
we go through before we actually get that cycle going?
Right. So if we're going to review the steps of the conflict cycle, before we understand the skills and how to use them, we want to just remember that we're identifying a triggering event, so what it is that made us feel a certain way. Second, we want to name those feelings. So what am I experiencing in the motion? And remember what Tom said about it being one word. That is a key thing that most people don't think about too much, but when you're trying to name a feeling, narrowing it down to one word is very difficult, but that is the key, that you know it's a feeling versus a thought.
Right.
Third, what are the thoughts running through my head in response to that triggering event? And they may or may not end up coming out of my mouth, but initially they're just a thought that's happening in my head about that. And then what am I doing? What am I expressing, and how am I expressing my feelings and my thoughts to the other person? So what are they experiencing because I'm behaving a certain way? And I love what Marcia said about the awareness of these things. There's an awareness and acknowledgement of these four things that has to happen before you can actually think about changing them.
I think emotions are the hardest too.
Very
because
difficult.
They can be strong, they
Right.
can be, you know, vague. You
Right.
don't know what the emotion is that you're feeling, but you just know that you've got one and
Right.
it's passionate and
Right.
strong. So, you know, that can be a really hard step.
Right.
And the
Recognizing
thoughts
it.
actually begin to rationalize the feelings. They begin to give them some strength, some credence with it. So they do work together with it. And whether one occurs a millisecond before the other is really immaterial. The fact is we need to recognize them.
And then it feeds kind of a righteousness for the behavior.
Right.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. So once this has happened, and this is one person, this has gone through, this is where this cycle takes over. So person one begins to act on those feelings and those thoughts, and they do so in such a way that it becomes a triggering event for the second person. And now the second person starts going through those same steps in reverse of the first person. So the triggering event, the feelings, the thoughts about that, turning those into a behavior, and bingo, there goes another triggering event.
Hence, cycle.
And that's the cycle, yes. This is something that we very commonly get into without thinking about it. And I guess that's our purpose in this, is to begin to show people what this actually is, what's actually going on. Because once you know that, you have the capability then to intervene with some of these skills. And as you say, if you don't recognize it, how are you going to put a new skill in there?
So if we were to try a different situation and run through it and show how the cycle works, let's take an example of two of us talking to each other, and maybe I say something to you like, you know, you should really consider maybe trying to lose a little bit of weight and you'd feel much better.
Nice triggering event.
Right? It's a fairly obvious triggering event as well.
All right, so to be transparent about that, I could feel angry that she's my so-called friend pointing out a flaw. I could feel shame about that. I could feel like, oh my God, I wish, you know, I know that, but let's not talk about it. I could feel betrayed. I could feel hurt. So the thoughts that I'm having about that is, you know, I could just want to end this transaction and say, well, you know, I really need to go. Or I could get defensive about it. I could, you know, get sarcastic about it. Say, you know, who's she to tell me what to do, and why are we even talking, you know, wow. I could get sarcastic, and I might even say, well, you know, you should know. Maybe you could give me some pointers. Ouch, you know?
Which, what happens then? Then that becomes my triggering event,
Yes.
right? So you say that's your behavior is to treat it, come back with a little bit of sarcasm, et cetera, and then that becomes my triggering event.
Around we go again.
Right,
Yeah.
and so here we go again. And so I perceive that as sarcasm and criticism, and then my feelings are hurt, and I'm annoyed maybe, or I might be embarrassed. I might feel very self-conscious. I might even feel guilty about that. You know, there might be some feelings of guilt in there as well. And so all of those things happen. And what I might be thinking is, I really didn't mean to hurt your feelings. That wasn't what my intention was not
Too
bad.
late.
Right?
Too late.
And if you go back to our past shows, we talked about how intentions are invisible.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so I might have intended to be looking out for your health.
My well-being,
Or, right.
yeah.
Maybe in the past you've said things to me like, oh, I can't stand, I really should lose, I really should. And so I was reacting to some past conversation that we've had, thinking
too.
I'm
How
helping you.
How dare you?
I know, thinking I'm helping you in some way.
So we are locked in this cycle.
Right, and my behavior then might be something like I might get defensive and I might use defensive words, you know, like I was just trying to help or something along those lines, which is a key thing also. Most of the time when you start a sentence with I was just, it's almost automatically a defensive
Sure.
sentence following that.
So that's not the only example. We got-
Now, let's try another one. I think, unfortunately, may be happening to many people at one time, and you can see it from both sides again. In this situation, we have a boss who has called an employee into the office to do an evaluation. And this does not go too well. So I'll play the boss giving Tracy, I guess you play the employee. And so this is what I say, well-meaning supposedly. You really need to focus more on your work, Tracy, and spend less time socialing with your fellow employees.
And so that is my trigger because my boss is now telling me what I need to do differently. And that doesn't go well, that doesn't sit well for me, and that triggers an emotion in me. I might feel embarrassed, I might feel angry with you, I might feel, I think, really misunderstood. Those things would all come to mind, and I'd certainly feel some judgment. That would feel, and I'd feel uncomfortable and wouldn't know what to do. So my thoughts might be, you know, to get that defensive mode going of, you know, I'm not the only one doing this, and how could you say that to me? I might be thinking things along the lines about, you know, you socialize all the time, and don't you understand that you're a terrible boss, and I'm the one that keeps up the camaraderie in the office, and that benefits the office. So you might not see those, but that might be what I'm thinking. I could have any number of behaviors that follows that. Typically, I might yell back, but I'm not sure a lot of people want to do that with their boss. I might start crying. I might leave the office.
You could call in sick.
I could call in sick, right? If it could go further, right? It could get extended into something longer term beyond this moment. A popular thing that people might do in a situation like that is go around and start talking to coworkers about what a terrible boss you are. So things like that come into play, and then I might say something to you like, I've got to go, and I'm leaving, and I don't know when I'll be back. Something along those lines.
So all those things that you just described, the internal things I as a boss wouldn't know necessarily, but I would see externally what's happening, which would be your behavior. So if you cried or you stomped out of the office, or I saw you talking with fellow employees and could only guess what you were saying, that becomes my triggering event.
Right.
So, and then I go through the cycle. I start to have some strong emotion about that, and some thoughts about that, which could range all over the place from feeling annoyed, confused about why you were doing that. My thinking would be, I never expected that, but her behavior was totally out of line. And if she doesn't apologize later, then I'm going to have to write her up because I can't have that kind of behavior exhibited in the office for other employees to see, and that kind of disrespect shown for me. So I have to turn those thoughts, those feelings, into behavior. And so what I might do, I'm not saying all bosses would, but what I might do in this case is to send you a memo indicating that I want to see you first thing the next morning, and if you wish to, you may bring a union representative with you. Now, I could only imagine what kind of a triggering event that might be for you.
It might trigger fear, right? I might lose my job. It could trigger a lot of things, and on it goes. So if we just keep going through those cycles, and we don't change something, we don't stop it and recognize.
Or if we're not aware.
Right. We don't recognize what those thoughts, what those feelings are, and the thoughts and the behaviors that follow. We just keep going round and round.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the point that we want to keep making is that this is very normal for us to react in this way, but we have to begin to think, and intervene in different ways so that this cycle doesn't get going. Because once it gets going, it generates its own feeling, its own venom.
And momentum.
Yes, and its own momentum.
Yeah, it feeds on itself.
Yes, it does. Let's take another situation that I have come across before. In this situation, a divorced father is listening to his daughter, a teenage daughter, complain about having to come to see him every weekend. Her thinking on this is that in doing so, it's not that she doesn't like to see her father, but that in doing so, she misses out on her friends who live in the community where her mother lives and where she normally resides. And she misses out on many school activities, sports and so forth, by having to see her father. So she is beginning to feel that, and he begins to sense that with it. So now we'll play this, and I'm the father with suddenly, you're going to play that? Okay, all right, we'll do that.
Dad.
So you give me a triggering event.
So over this, I just don't want to come this weekend. I don't understand why I have to be there. I've got stuff to do. What's up with this, Dad? Ugh.
So that body language, that anguish on her face, that tone of voice, that's really coming across. And now that's my triggering event. So here I am, I'm starting the cycle. So yes, the feelings go on then, don't they?
Yeah.
If that's a triggering event for
Well, I may be feeling like, oh, I'm like such a victim of this. This is not my fault that they couldn't get along. It takes, extra time for me to be in both places. Don't they understand? I have a life. I don't want to do this. It's just wrong. And I might make up excuses or stories to get out of it because that's an easy way. Tell mom you're impossible. I don't want to go there. Make up some story, or even make up a third reason why I don't have to be with either one of you.
So that in turn then becomes the triggering event for me. And then I begin to fear. Some of the feeling that I'm having is fearing, oh my gosh, I'm losing my daughter. If I don't have contact with her, how am I going to know what's going on in her life? And she's voicing that she really doesn't want to see me that much. She's more interested in her friends, which is a normal developmental thing, but it's still hard for me as a dad to hear that. So in my thinking might be, if I don't win this battle, I'm not going to see my daughter at all. I might end up really losing my relationship with her. And I also fear that her mother may side with her. It's much more convenient for her mother to have her there too. And her mother thinks, why shouldn't she be with her friends and experiencing her sports and so forth? So I feel kind of helpless too with this whole situation. So facing that, my behavior then becomes one of maybe blaming the mother. Your mother put you up to this. She was the one who wanted the divorce after all. So if not my fault that you're in this predicament, and if you don't do what I want you to and come to see me at all, I'm going to court and make it happen.
Oh, and that really makes you an appealing person to visit,
Yeah, I can imagine what kind of
Threaten
triggering
me.
event that is for you. Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, we're going to have fun. So, all right, so how can we stop? How can we intervene? What can we do with this cycle? If we're able to identify our emotions and our thoughts and our behaviors, there are two places where you can apply some positive influence. In terms of emotions, you really can't control them. They are going to come. You're going to be flooded. That isn't something that you can alter. However, we can alter our thoughts, and we can alter our behavior.
Yes, these last two.
Either party or whatever party in the cycle has that opportunity. It doesn't weigh on one person or the other. As you're going around the cycle, any party in the conflict has the opportunity to substitute a different behavior or a different thought to make it more productive. It doesn't mean that the conflict is solved, but it takes it in a different direction, offers you maybe a less charged triggering event, and it might be shorter.
So the possibility of resolution is there.
And we can use some of these skills that we've talked about before. We could use an I statement. Instead of an accusation, you could say, well, when this happens, I feel.
Well, I could go to the good listening instead of reacting to it. And I could, as you say, restate that, what she's feeling.
Clarifying questions.
Right. So at least my daughter is feeling heard.
Yeah.
That's a very important step in that.
Help me understand why you don't want to come visit.
That's
instead
right.
of telling me.
That hasn't solved it yet,
No.
but it's putting it on a different track from this cycle.
Right, and in the scenario with the daughter and the father, something, if you're going to alter your thoughts a little bit, right now you're thinking, I might lose my daughter, it's all, her mother's fault, etc. You might think, well, maybe there are some other things I could do that maybe it's not a loss. Maybe I can find some other ways to stay connected to her, because that's really the main thing of what you might need from her.
And maybe if my daughter experienced me not as someone just being hard and fast on this
And following
thinking
the rules.
He's just doing it for his own self. If she were to look at it as, wow, my dad is really understanding.
Right.
He gets it.
Right. He understands that
leads
it's
us
hard
then
for
into
me.
the different things we've looked at in compromising,
Yeah.
working out something that we both could come away with and say, I can live with this, and the relationship is preserved.
I think we have time for one more example that maybe
Okay.
without, maybe we can just let it flow through the cycles without stopping it all the time. So
Okay.
people could maybe see something familiar. And this is going to be between Tom and Tracy and their partners, and the triggering event is one of finances. Tom has discovered, he's looking at the credit card bill, and there are late charges. They've had this conversation before, and why don't you take it from there, Tom?
Okay. Oh my gosh, look at this bill. Tracy, what the heck were you thinking? There's over $700 in charges here. We had conversations about this.
What are you talking about?
Yes.
So, Tom,
$700?
I see.
Where's that
but
money going to come from?
I don't know. You're scaring me a little bit. So,
Well, I'm scared too.
Yeah.
You better be scared. Look at that.
wow. Okay. So, what is a triggering event for me? right?
That would be a trigger event.
So many things. So the triggering event is you pointing out to me that there is something off about something that we had agreed to, in your mind at least. And that made me feel very emotional. It made me feel a little bit fearful. It made me feel panicked. Certainly made me want to defend myself, so I felt very defensive.
What behaviors did you pick up on that really fed that?
A little in my face.
Okay.
That's where some of the kind of fear and anxiety-ish feelings come from for me. You were in my face, you're pointing, and you're angry, and your tone of voice was a little bit harsh for me. It felt very bossy and overpowering, yes, and controlling. So that would definitely trigger those emotions for me. My thoughts were, who does he think he is? Why is he telling me all of this stuff? A little bit of, is he right? Like where I'm trying to look on the piece of paper and say, that's not possible. I couldn't possibly have spent that much money, and try and kind of reevaluate and see where that must have come from, because it couldn't be accurate. So that's where a little more defensive-ness might come in also. And then my behavior was just to be kind of dumbfounded, and I couldn't speak a little bit. I had trouble articulating, and so I was very standoffish, but also at the same time a little aggressive, but not quite quite being there.
In this case, you were a little bit recessive and defensive and trying to get into it. But in another case, you might have retaliated and shot back and said, you know, who are you to tell me what to do? I make the money here too.
Right.
You know, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do another cycle with this.
Okay.
But I hope that we've had some takeaways about an awareness of this cycle and how one stage feeds against another.
Yes.
And
That
I'm
these
sure
skills are used to break into that cycle with it.
I'm sure we'll revisit this.
Yes.
But we're at the end of our time again.
Okay.
So if you had a takeaway, what would you say?
I mean, I think if I were to consolidate all of this and just say a takeaway for the viewers today, just to remember that in what situation you're in and you're trying to have these conversations, that you want to be focusing on what you're feeling, and remember that that is one word. Focus on your thoughts and know that you can change them. And focus on your behaviors and know that you can change those as well. And once you can focus and be aware and acknowledge those things within yourself, that's when you can start to make a change.
There still may be a counter-triggering event, but it may be different than one if you weren't aware.
And not so intense.
Right.
So Tom, how can we?
So I guess we have reached the end of our time here. And I would like to again invite our viewers to comment on the show by emailing us at the relationshiptoolbox@gmail.com. We will not be answering individual emails, but we will be responding to your suggestions, and we really would like to see those. Be sure to look for our next show on how mediation works in resolving conflicts within relationships or within the family. And we thank you for watching.